Welcome everybody. Thank you for coming on this lovely summer's day. I'm Ginny Lee. I'm the Associate Dean Engagement here, and it's my very great pleasure to welcome you today. I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the land of the Wurundjeri people, and would like to pay my respects to their elders past and present and families. Today, Jane Rendell has come via Adelaide, where is the Critique conference symposium that invited her as keynote, via Mount Gambier, and a bit of road travel to speak to us today. And I'll just read. She is a writer who's developed a position on critical spatial practice and sight writing through such authored books as Sight Writing, 2010, Art and Architecture, 2006, and The Pursuit of Pleasure, 2002. And she's co-edited collections such as Pattern, 2007, Critical Architecture, 2007, Spatial Imagination, 2005, The Unknown City, 2001, Intersections, 2000, Gender, Space and Architecture, one of my favourites, 1999, and Strangely Familiar, another one of my favourites, 1995. She's currently working on a new book on transitional spaces in architecture and psychoanalysis, and recent essays have been commissioned by artists such as Jasmina Cibic, Apollonia Susterek and Transparadiso, and institutions such as FRAC Centre, Orleans, and Hamburger Bahnhof, Berlin. She's on the editorial board for ARQ, Architectural Research Quarterly, Architectural Theory Review, The Happy Hypocrite, the Journal of Visual Culture in Britain, Ultima Thule and Zetesis. She's Professor of Architecture and Art at the Bartlett. And in her spare time, I'm not sure.
Researching mining.
Researching mining, which is a whole other story. Anyway, today she's going to speak to you about Coming to Welsh, a sight writing.
Thanks, Jenny. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's very nice to be back. And thank you for making the time to come along. Quite difficult, I imagine, to tear yourself away from the lovely day, summer's day that it is, and it's amazing for me because my body's telling me that it should be very cold and dark, so it's just wonderful to be in the Melbourne summer. So I'm just going to talk for about 45 minutes. It's a written paper. I hope that's okay, but hopefully there'll be a chance afterwards for you to engage and ask questions and so on. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, a kind of slightly more conceptual part of the talk, which looks at some of the concepts and theoretical framings behind this sight writing practice that I've been developing. And then I'm going to talk through actually two different projects. Coming to Welsh is one, and another one called An Embellishment Perda. So sight writing is a way of practicing the situatedness of criticism, a way of attempting to interpret the object, and to perform this interpretation to another through the act of remaking an artefact in words. Such a project involves rethinking the terms of criticism, specifically judgment, discrimination, and critical distance, from a spatial perspective, one where space is material and architectural rather than solely metaphoric. And I'm interested in how criticism as a practice can investigate the spatial and often changing positions that we occupy as critics, materially, conceptually, emotionally, and ideologically. When the art critic Hal Foster discusses the need to rethink critical distance, he points to the different distances produced by the optical and the tactile, but warns of the dangers of what he calls disidentification and over-identification with the object of study. Foster rejects those who lament the end of true criticality, as well as those who he says see critical distance as a form of instrumental mastery in disguise. And that critique's actually a critique of the work of the feminist philosopher Luce Irigaray. So it's a kind of critique of some forms of feminist criticism. However, despite advocating the need to think through questions of critical distance, Foster still proposes that the critic's role is to judge and make decisions without, I think, fully examining how these modes of operation might be spatially conditioned. Also drawing attention to critical distance, but in response to literary works, the literary critic Isabel Armstrong has closely examined the differences between what she calls close and distant reading. Armstrong distinguishes between a criticism of affect and one of analysis, but she rejects the tendency to use a binary model to divide feeling and thought. Instead, she calls for affect to be included within rational analysis, which I think is an interesting position and maybe one we want to talk more about, to be included within rational analysis. And she says the task of a new definition of close reading is to rethink the power of affect, feeling and emotion in a cognitive space. The power of affect needs to be included within a definition of thought and knowledge rather than theorised as outside them, excluded from the rational. Using a highly spatialised language, Armstrong argues that it's the feeling-thought binary which itself installs a form of critique where the subject is located in a position of power over the text as other, producing a form of distant rather than close reading. She states that this form of reading rests upon an account of the text, and we might substitute the text there for the object if we're art or architectural critics, or sight even, as something that's outside, something that's external, which has to be grasped in some way or warded off. By repositioning the artwork as a site, my interest is investigating the spatiality of the critic's relation to a work, and in doing so, adopting and also adapting Howard Cagel's notion of strategic critique, where a position of judgment is advanced through the process of criticising itself, as well as paralleling Gavin Butt's call for the recognition of what he says is an immanent rather than a transcendent mode of contemporary criticality, apprehended within and instanced as the performative act of critical engagement itself. So making an argument here for critical judgment, if indeed it is judgment, to be approached through the process of criticising, not decided a priori. Critics from feminist and performance studies have also expressed an interest in the performative qualities of criticism. Amelia Jones and Andrew Stevenson, for example, take issue with the tradition that the interpreter must be neutral or disinterested in the objects which he or she judges, and posit instead that the process of viewing and interpreting involve what they call entanglement in intersubjective spaces of desire, projection and identification. Interpretation, they argue, like the production of works of art, is a mode of communication. Meaning is a process of engagement and never dwells in only one place. The spatial and often changing positions we occupy as critics create conditions for engagement, which make possible then acts of interpretation and constructions of meaning. My practice of sight writing operates in the interactive space between the critic and their site of inquiry, which could be a place, it could be an artwork, a piece of architecture, but it's also the place or the sites between the written work produced, the essay or the text, and the reader. In thinking about the position of the other in criticism and in psychoanalysis, the work of Jean Laplanche is quite illuminating. For Laplanche, the message imparted by the subject to the other is an enigma, both to the receiver but also to the sender of the message. He says messages are enigmatic because they're strange to themselves. So for Laplanche, the critic, or the recipient analyst, is involved in a two-way dynamic with the enigmatic message. He or she is poised between the enigma which is addressed to him, but also the enigma of the one he addresses, his public. So the enigmatic message is moving between the critic, who, if we compare it to the process of analysis, is the analysand, responding to the artwork or a piece of architecture as an enigma that isn't fully understandable, but also the response that the critic makes, which could be in the form of an essay, but it could also be in the form of another work, and I'll get to that shortly, is also producing another enigma for the viewer or the reader of that secondary work or that piece of criticism. So following Laplanche, rather than use psychoanalytic theory to try and explain a work, or the unconscious aspects of a work, which can quite often be the way that psychoanalysis operates, or even perhaps understanding the particular psychic dynamics of the artist or the architect, I'm more interested in suggesting that the critic or analyst is presented with the work as an enigma, and that he or she also produces another enigma in the form of a critical essay. So in this sense, the critic does not only respond to a work through the traditional modes of academic analysis and interpretation, more commonly thought of as criticism, but also through more associative states. So the states that would be on the side of the analysand in psychoanalysis, which might be remembering, they might be imagining, daydreaming, and so forth. So my sight writing tries to work both modes, and I'm constantly shifting the balance and kind of rethinking and reworking these two linked functions of psychoanalysis, the analysand's free association and the psychoanalyst's evenly suspended attentiveness. So in doing so, I think what might happen in the process of engagement with an object includes finding a voice, or maybe even finding a number of voices in criticism, which are discovered in relation to the object. These could be from the close-up, from the glance, from the caress, the accidental brush, and they could draw on spaces as they're dreamed and imagined, as well as they're observed, in order to position and then reposition the critic in relation to a work, and perhaps to start to question criticism as a form of knowledge with a singular and static point of view that's located in the here and now. I've tried to explore the use of prepositions in order to investigate how variations in position and voice might shift the relation between the critic and her object of study, from one of mastery, where the object is under critique, or distance, writing about an object, to one of relation and dialogue, writing to the object, and also equivalence, writing as the object. And in fact, recently I've become most interested, in this idea of writing as the object. Analogy, the desire to invent a writing that is somehow like the artwork, allows a certain creativity to intervene in the critical act, as the critic comes to understand and interpret the work by remaking it through a different medium on his or her own terms. The object then sort of offers possibilities or suggestions for determining where the writing might go. But how does one decide how to make or remake an object in words? Which things will come into focus, which will fade into the background, which will get accepted or applauded, and which are challenged, questioned, perhaps even rejected? And which are those things that have not even been noticed? With this in mind, this notion of remaking or perhaps even practicing the object, the tendency is towards activities of use. And for me, the critic is a particular form of situated spectator, not just a viewer, but also a user. What does it mean to use an object, a concept, an artwork, even an artist, rather than to relate to one? In his 1968 paper, The Use of an Object, D.W. Winnicott describes how relating may be to a subjective object, but usage implies that the object is part of external reality. For Winnicott, to use an object is to take into account its objective reality or existence as a thing in itself, rather than its subjective reality or existence as a form of projection. The change from relating to using for him is significant. It means that the subject destroys the object. The object comes to stand not inside as an internalized object, but outside, the omnipotent control of the subject, recognised as the external object it has always been. What's interesting about Winnicott's observation, well, for me at least, is the shift from objective to subjective occurs through use and is precisely spatial. The object ends up in a different place, outside, not inside. Reflecting on this, I wonder whether my impulse to write artworks is a form of use, perhaps even a form of destruction. And if so, then sight writing might go some way to engage with how critics might use rather than view artworks, and how using art might be really rather different from viewing art. To use rather than view art seems a slightly unusual position perhaps for a critic to adopt, given the optical terms of visual culture, but to me, coming from architecture, it seems a much more appropriate way to approach the spatial concerns of architectural discourse, and also perhaps the more functional creative practice of design, which provides a use in response to a need. So those last comments are actually, you know, the more kind of recent ways that I'm thinking about this in terms of use. And I think, which I've sort of explored elsewhere but not really written yet, becoming more interested in what's happened to the discourse around functionality and design and the way that it's played out now through different ideas of program narrative, perhaps parametrics. I'm not sure whether I'll go particularly in that direction, but certainly through perhaps the poetics of use. So what I'd like to do now is just move on and present two different pieces of work from the collection of essay site writing. The first one is called To Miss the Desert, and it was written in relation to an artwork by Nathan Coley called Black Tent from 2003, which was curated by Gavin Wade for a show called Art and Sacred Spaces. Around the edge. The bathroom has a floor of polished marble, black, interwoven with white veins. Perched on the toilet with her feet dangling off the ground, she traces the white lines with her gaze. She keeps alert for cockroaches. At any time, one might crawl through the cracks around the edge of the room and into the blackness. 14. Floor finishes. Location G6. Lay new flooring, 300mm by 300mm, terracotta unglazed tiles with sandstone colour grout, 10mm wide joints. All tiles to be laid out from centre line. Finished floor level to match G5. All the floors are marble, smooth and cool, laid out in careful grids, except for the big golden rug next to the sofa. She likes to follow its intricate patterns with her feet, like paths around a secret garden. But if you dance around the edge of the squares, you mustn't be silly enough to fall in. Who knows what could lie in wait for you in an enchanted garden? Along one edge of her garden are a number of small rooms. These are home to Ghulam and Kareem. Ghulam is tall and fair-skinned with light hair and eyes. Kareem is shorter, stockier, with darker skin, hair and eyes. They fought each other in the past, and they'll fight again when the Soviets come to Kabul, and then again when her own people search the Hindu Kush to wipe out all evil. But for now, there's no fighting. Once the sun has gone down, they sit and eat together. He's a man with property and wives. Inside the walls of his house are sunlit orchards with trees full of dark purple fruit. A group of women dressed in different shades of red watch them arrive. Some have covered their faces, but she can still see pink nail varnish on their toes, and as her family draws closer, the women disappear. 14. Floor finishes. Location 1.5 and G5. Vaubonan lino sheeting 1.5mm to be laid out on 6mm WBP ply subfloor. Ply and lino to run under appliances and around kitchen units. Colour TBA by client. Aluminium threshold at junction with G2, G6 and 1.1. They sit upstairs in a long veranda overlooking the garden. The only furniture is a carpet laid down in a line down the middle of the room. Important men from the village, all in turbans, sit cross-legged around the edges of the carpet and eat from dishes laid out between them. Her mother, her sister and herself are the only women, and as they walk back down through the dark house to leave, she sees a pair of eyes watching her from behind a screen. The eyes belong to a girl with the hands of a woman who glints with silver. Later she learns that this is Kareem's youngest wife, once a nomad who carries her wealth in the jewels on her fingers. So, a little bit of a kind of commentary on that. Black Tent had developed out of Nathan Coley's interest in religious structures in general, but particularly the evocative and precise description of the construction of the tabernacle given in the Bible. The curator Gavin Wade had read a piece of my writing where I questioned whether it was possible to write architecture rather than write about architecture, and so he asked me to write a tabernacle. Quite a challenge. And I felt that the text in the Bible was already a writing of the tabernacle, and so I decided to write Black Tent. Black Tent consists of a flexible structure, a number of steel-framed panels with black fabric screens stretched across them, and small coloured squares, I think you can see clearly here, perhaps just on the right there as well, transparent windows cross-stitched, inserted into the screens. Black Tent moved through a number of different sites in the town of Portsmouth, including 2 in the cathedral, 1 in a school, another in a shopping centre, another in a park, reconfiguring itself for each location. The essay that I wrote tried to echo aspects of Black Tent, so the differing configuration of the panels depending on their situation. Each section of the essay is composed around a different spatial condition, like the one I just read, around the edge. And it also, like Coley's work, tries to look at different kinds of boundary condition, specific and generic, personal and political, material and psychic. And also, again, paralleling Coley's interest in the bounded site of the religious sanctuary, my spatial motifs are also sanctuaries, but actually, and this is perhaps where the critique comes in, secular sanctuaries of home and refuge. So the narrative itself, like the squares, has 2 sides, or perhaps it's actually 2 faces. 2 voices are pitched against one another to try and create a dynamic or perhaps tension between public and private sanctuary. One voice remembers a childhood spent in various nomadic cultures and countries in the Middle East. The other adopts a rather more professional tone to describe various sanctuaries at different scales and also stages of the design process. And these texts are drawn from construction specifications that I produced when designing contemporary sanctuaries, specifically a series of community buildings for different so-called minority groups. So I think within this work, within this kind of remaking of Nathan's Black Tent as a piece of writing, what I'm engaging with is how to take certain qualities from the work that might be formal, they might be conceptual, and to transpose them into writing and to use the techniques of writing, spatial techniques of writing, to do so. So I think with some of them there's an attempt to write as, but actually what I've been sort of discovering in that process is that even by copying or a mimetic act of writing as, or an analogous act, one's always interpreting in some way. And so for me, I guess the critical interpretation of Coley's work is a questioning of the Judeo-Christian tradition that he's following through the religious tabernacle, and also positioning it in a cathedral, a Christian cathedral. And I'm trying then to kind of peel off from that and try to think of sanctuary both within in other parts of the essay that I don't have time to read out, within the Bedouin tradition of black tents as nomadic structures, and also the Islamic traditions of pattern in architecture, and also the traditions of Muslim cultures, sanctuaries in Muslim cultures. So that was something that was, I think, quite implicit in the writing, where I didn't make it explicit. And then I started to work with that a bit further, and what often happens in my work, I've noticed, is that I'll leave something to settle for a little bit and then start working on it again. So several years later, I sort of returned to this essay, and this time made a new piece of work out of it. So in 2006, I was directing a research cluster called Spatial Imagination in Design, along with 14 other designers and architects, and we were looking at different aspects of imagination in design, not only the benign, but also some of the more paranoid workings of it, I would say. And we produced an exhibition. I won't go through all the details of that here, and a catalogue and website. So it was in a domestic setting, a gallery called the Domobal Gallery in London, which is a gallery within a domestic house. And the piece that I made was called An Embellishment Purdah, and it was a 2-part installation. Don't worry so much, you don't need to be able to read that text, I'm showing the layout. So for this work I selected 12 short extracts or scenes from To Miss the Desert, the longer essay, that's on the left. And these were laid out in the catalogue as a grid to match the 12 panes of glass in the west-facing window of the gallery, where across the glass I repeatedly wrote the word Purdah in black eyeliner kohl in the script of Afghanistan's official language. I chose to respond to the west-facing gallery window as a threshold site, which link back to some memories of mine of occupying threshold positions during my childhood. So this was one of the scenes. Sorry, it's not come out right, but you can see a kind of glimpse of the sort of texture of the writing. So this is a kind of childhood photo snap of a threshold position. My home in Darfur in El Fasher, in about 69 I think. And then another one that I was interested in, which was a view from a window looking back into the house which I lived in as a child in Kabul in Afghanistan in 71 to 74. And also an interest that I had in rugs, in particular certain kinds of rugs. This is a type of rug called an enzi, which also worked not just as floor decoration but also as curtains or doors of tents in nomadic cultures in northern Afghanistan. So a rug which operates as a door. The term purdah means curtain in Persian and describes the cultural practice of separating and hiding women through clothing and architecture, veils, screens and walls from the public male gaze. The fabric veil has been compared to its architectural equivalent, the mashrabiyah, an ornate wooden screen and a feature of traditional North African domestic architecture, which is also a demarcation of the line between public and private space. The origins of purdah, culturally, religiously and geographically, are highly debated. They're connected to class as well as sex. And the current manifestation of this gendered spatial practice varies according to location and involves covering different combinations of women's hair, face, eyes and body. In Afghanistan, for example, although in 1959 the Prime Minister Mohammed Daoud had abolished veiling and seclusion for women, when the Taliban took over Kabul in September 96, they issued edicts prohibiting women from working outside the home, attending school, or even leaving the home unless accompanied by a close male relative or chaperone, a mahram, a husband, brother, father or son. Women were not permitted to wear white socks or shoes, because this was the colour of the Taliban flag, nor footwear that made a sound when they walked, and houses and buildings with women present in them, in public view, were to have their windows painted. In public, women had to hide themselves. I'm sure you've seen images like this in a shadari, which is a variation of the Persian chador, meaning tent, a loose garment, often shown in sky blue, but that's not the only colour that's worn, covering the body from head to foot with only an embroidered mesh, a window through which to see and breathe. And it's this screen which plays such a key role in Western representations of the veil, presenting as it does an enigmatic view of the other woman, whose eyes may be outlined in black coal, but perhaps only in the imagination. Given this kind of history and description of the cultural practice of purdah, it's interesting and understandable that in discussions around the veil there's a lot of controversy, especially in feminism. In an account of arguments for and against the veil raised in early 20th century Egypt in response to the publication in 1899 of Qasim Iman's Tara al-Mara, The Liberation of Women, the feminist cultural historian Leila Ahmed argues that in identifying the veil as a tool of female oppression, feminism has perhaps unwittingly, along with anthropology, played the role of handmaid to colonialism. In using the veil to represent Muslim culture as backward, Ahmed argues that the aim of unveiling women in order to liberate them from repression has operated as the mode of justification for one patriarchal culture to possess another. This, she says, is an attitude and practice witnessed historically, for example, in the French colonisation of Algeria, where, as Ahmed quotes from Frantz Fanon's The Dying Colonialism in 1967, the occupier was bent on unveiling Algeria. And of course, more recently, unveiling was given as one of the key reasons to justify the invasion of Afghanistan by more contemporary crusaders, the US, the UK and their various allies. And it was very interesting at the time of the need to justify the invasion of Afghanistan, you would find in the public media in the UK, there would quite often also be a story about the oppression of women under the Taliban as a way of trying to justify the need to invade in order to liberate Afghanistan. Repetition is the acting out of what has been repressed in the unconscious. And the artist Sharon Kifland has pointed out that repetition for Freud is the incessant exposure to horrible or upsetting events and circumstances, the compulsion to repeat an act when its origins are forgotten. Unless one remembers the past, if events are suppressed, something is returned in one's action. For an embellishment purder, in repeatedly writing the same word across the glass, focusing on its precise formation again and again, I recalled my school days writing out sentences, aiming to make my handwriting as small as possible, so that as a left-hander I didn't smudge the ink. And in trying not to spoil the perfect letters formed of liquid coal, I realised I was writing from left to right, against the flow of an Arabic or a Persian text. Calligraphy has been used as a screening device by artists such as Mona Hatoum in her Measures of Distance from 1988, where video images of the artist's mother are overlaid with the Arabic text of the letters she sent to her daughter from Beirut. And in her photographs of women covered in calligraphy, Lala Assaidi focuses on how this Islamic art form has been made inaccessible to women, whereas the use of henna as a form of adornment is considered women's work. Describing the oppression of women's lives in Shia areas, such as Herat in western Afghanistan, the journalist Christina Lamb's book, The Sewing Circles of Herat, discovers how, in order for women writers to read, share ideas and study banned foreign literature, they had to meet under the guise of sewing groups, such as the Golden Eagle Sewing Circle. In taking the form of an adornment or embellishment, repetition, as a kind of remembering, can also be linked to reminiscence. Sharon Kifland's account continues, and while the analytic process may not aim at reliving past experience, at feeling the same emotions of the past, this still happens. In reminiscing, stories are embellished, made better or worse, and so occupy a register of the imaginary. I imagined that for an embellishment purder, when the sun set, the writing would, like a rug, form a pattern on the gallery floor, where the viewer's shadow, facing west, away from Mecca, would be cast behind him or her. So often the rugs like the Enzi are often used as prayer mats, and it's important what their orientation is in relation to Mecca. So in this work I'm purposely positioning it so that the position of light coming in would face away from Mecca. But in early January, the time of the year that the work was installed, the sun was too low in the sky to create the intended shadow. Yet other unexpected effects were produced which resonated with the concerns of the piece. So to perform the writing, I had to stand in the window with my face screened, occupying a position behind the veil of writing that I'd created and hadn't quite imagined that I would be positioned there. And as night fell, light from inside the gallery illuminated my body. And this is the only image that I have. I never planned to document the process of writing on the window, or certainly that it would take so long to write that it would be dark by the time I was finished. The Iranian director Mushin Makhmalbaf's film, Kandahar from 2001, tells the story of an Afghan woman journalist living in Canada who travels back to Afghanistan when her sister writes from Kandahar to say she's going to kill herself before the next solar eclipse. The female protagonist's journey is at times filmed from behind the veil she is wearing, offering Western audiences a view out from the interior, so reversing the usual media representation of the camera imaging a covered faceless figure. The rise of interest in the veil, evidenced through cultural forms, whether they be films, artworks or literature, has increased dramatically since the Western invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq. But these stories, told from behind the veil, are often authored by those who have not experienced the reality directly, extending the problem of the Western-dominated representation of the veil in the media, which journalist Christina Noel Karimi's opinion has rendered Afghan women faceless and voiceless. The veil obscures their faces, she says, while others tell their stories. An embellishment purder doesn't seek to make a judgment on the veil. Rather, it wishes to see how things might seem quite different depending on who and where you are. From inside the gallery and outside on the street, by day and by night, the work changes according to the position occupied, sometimes transparent, at other times opaque, revealing then concealing, This embellishment or decorative covering invites the viewer to imagine beyond the places he or she can see. And probably a return to this work for me, I'm not sure when it will happen, but I feel that the gallery was a really interesting site to have as an opportunity to experiment, but actually I think the positioning of a work like this needs to be done more as a kind of form of acupuncture somehow, and find a kind of cultural pressure point, which could be a room opposite the American embassy, for example, would have been the perfect place while the Iraq War was being planned to perform this. So I'm interested in the gallery as this site of exploration, but perhaps it not quite having the cultural resonance for this kind of politicised work, or perhaps also working with a group of Afghan writers, that kind of thing. So that project's sort of on hold for a little while I'm developing some others, but I'm sure it will be something that I'm going to return to. And so I just want to finish now with the second sight writing and the Coming to Welsh work, which is more recent work that I've been working on. So the starting point for this is a project called Longing for the Lightness of Spring. The culmination of all longing and desire. Spring, a piece of work by artist Alina Brotherus, was commissioned by Jules Wright for the Wapping Project in London. It was an installation composed of two pieces, a backlit image, untitled, showing a pale grey Icelandic sky over lava covered in moss, reflected in a water tank on the roof, and a video triptych, rain, the oak forest, and flood, which were shown in the boiler house at this disused pump station. A work that anticipates spring. Spring opened in Wapping just after the autumn equinox in the Northern Hemisphere. And in response to Alina's work, Spring, I wrote 3 personal texts and inserted these into a longer critical essay. So I'm just going to read the three texts that I wrote. Moss Green. It's a beautiful house, a one-storey building with a square plan, born at the birth of modernism in the aftermath of the First World War. It embodies the values of early English modernism, of the arts and crafts movement, truth to materials and honest craftsmanship. From the road it looks a little unloved, in need of some care and attention. Up close it's clearly derelict, almost in ruins. We enter a room with windows at each end. Curtains are falling away from the runners. The fabric has been soaked overnight and is drying in the spring afternoon sunshine. And on the windowsill and spilling over onto the floor are piles of old magazines. The pages are stuck together and disintegrate if you pull them apart. There are some photographs of buildings. One is particularly damp, the corners are soft, the surface is wrinkled. It shows a tower block, just completed, empty and pristine. A moss green utopia, the modernist dream dispersing as it soaks up spring rain. White linen. I dreamt of the house last night, my mother's house in Cwmgor, South Wales, a place where it always rained in the holidays, that as a girl I resented. But now, as it's being taken from me, I already begin to miss. I was in the dining room, the rest of the house was empty except this one room. The furniture was far too big and covered in linen. The air was thick and still, silent. With the curtains drawn it was very dark, but the linen glowed white, and as I went towards the mantelpiece to take a look at myself in the mirror, I saw for the first time in the reflection that the room was full of plants, so alive I could smell moisture still on their leaves. Bittersweet. In Palafrugell, a small town north of Barcelona on the Costa Brava, is a derelict cork factory with a clock tower in front. The clock tower is a handsome structure, elegant and robust, but the clock on top has stopped. The floor is covered in dust and pieces of furniture, lampstands, chairs, or printing machinery. There are words everywhere, scattered all over the floor. Burnt orange, turquoise, black and white, bittersweet. We stay in the factory a long time, we don't speak, just walk and look, and later once we've left the building he brings something to show me. It's a white sign with carefully painted black letters, bittersweet. I reach into my bag and pull out a clear perspex rod. Along one side of it, letters printed onto the cardboard are embedded. From the top it's out of focus, but from the side you can read it. Bittersweet. So Moss Green describes a derelict house in the Greenbelt where in spring, in early March, we found photographs of a brave new world of modernist high-rise housing. Just after the autumn equinox, just after her death, I dreamt of the home of my Welsh great aunt, and White Linen records this dream, where Bittersweet remembers another spring visit, this time to an abandoned cork factory in Catalonia, where we found the names of colours scattered all over the floor. The three texts made spatial and visual associations with Brotheress's work and in a sense used certain aspects of her work, formal as well as conceptual, as sort of constraints. The structure of the triptych, the textures of moss and lava, the colour palette of monochromes and pastels. Conceptually, the three texts I wrote juxtapose my own fascination with the backwards gaze of nostalgia in relation to Brotheress's interest in anticipation as a longing that looks forward rather than backward. For an expedition to Seoul in Korea, as a piece called What is the Colour of Memory, each text was translated into Korean and accompanied by its object. So an album of photographs found at Moss Green, a white linen cloth, and the word bittersweet found in the factory. And to return or journey to Los Angeles, as another text work called The Voice One Cannot Control, the texts were translated back into written English from the Korean audio recordings. So in moving, the words were translated from English to Korean and back again, and from writing to speaking and back again, and exhibited in a show at SCI-Arc called Concrete Feedback, where the three pairs of texts were positioned along this corridor on either side of three columns, where the audio voice came from above, at the point where the two texts could no longer be read together. The work moved again, this time to a show in London called for a show called Material Intelligence and a piece called Les mots and les choses. So this time the three objects were reinserted, cited in this slippage of language produced through translation and displacement. In Les mots and les choses from 1966, translated into English as The Order of Things, Michel Foucault explores the ordering of relationships between different cultural elements, for example, those that are real, those that represent, those that resemble, those that can be imagined. So between words and things, between one place and another, this sight writing is a two-way inscription, real and imagined, dreamed and remembered, of sights written and also writings cited. So this work has again moved on to develop in two very different ways. The photographs in the album from the Moss Green house have become the topic of my current book, and a project called May Morn, which examines nostalgia and yearning. It looks back at how the future was dreamed by those who designed the buildings that formed the inspiration for the political and formal origins of the UK welfare state architecture of the 50s, from the present moment where much of it is being demolished. So this is one of the photographs that I found at the Moss Green house. And the whole set of photographs, I'm now locating the different buildings. So they were photographed sometime, it must be in the 50s, at the start of this programme of housing post-World War II. Some of it quite iconic, some of it not so much, but that's been the starting point of this project May Morn, which looks at mourn as in mourning, looking forward, and mourning as in death and mourning for death. So posed at this position between looking forward and looking backward. But another part of the work is actually moving on from the white linen text and the dream that I had. And this was most recently reworked as a piece called Coming to Welsh, a sight writing, which comprised a text work designed by a graphic artist called Marit Munzberg and an installation at the Mission Gallery in Swansea in May, just past, as part of a bigger project by an artist called Bella Kerr called Keeper, along with some other artists, Catherine Faulkner and Karen Ingram. So each of us was given a week to make an installation. And this was Bella's piece. So this work, Coming to Welsh, is inspired by a Welsh dresser that's part of my childhood and mother's family. I remember it in the dining room of my great aunt's house in South Wales, where it held delicate ornaments lustre jugs that I might break, but also lots of more useful things like rubber bands, pencils, rulers, buttons, needles and thread, and rather oddly, red dye. And there were also cuttings placed between the jugs that were taken from local newspapers reporting births, weddings and deaths in the family. The white linen text had been included in an essay about the Welsh dresser that Bella Kerr had read, and as part of her work Keeper, she invited me to inhabit the Mission Gallery, Swansea, for 1 week to respond to her work, which was sculptural elements, tables and towers she had created for gathering and holding objects relating to her own childhood. So this was a disused mission chapel in South Wales that has more recently become used as an art gallery. The Welsh Dresser essay combines photographs of objects from the dresser with dictionary definitions of the objects and memories from childhood which those objects have triggered. The theoretical ideas about what it means to use childhood memories as a way of writing the history of a piece of furniture and how autobiography and experimental memoir can be valuable forms of evidence are key to my conceptual interest in historiography. This informs the ways in which I examine personal history and private life in the Welsh Dresser essay. Although I trained and worked as an architect, when I returned to university to do a master's in architectural history, a course which was really an introduction to the philosophy of history, it started me thinking about why we value some objects and not others, and how we interpret pieces of evidence, and also the different ways in which history can be written. So I'm interested through this site writing project in what feminist theories which focus on the personal and subjective can offer architectural history in placing emphasis on subjectivity and positionality. Shortly after my great aunt died, I dreamt about her home. In the dream, I enter a room and all the furniture is far too big and covered in white linen, and then I walk to the mantelpiece and take a look at myself in the mirror, finding that in the reflection the room is not dead, but alive, full of plants. The Welsh dresser is inherited down the female line. My great aunt did not have children, and so my mother, her eldest niece, inherited the dresser. So as the eldest daughter, tradition has it that one day the Welsh dresser will be mine. And I talk of the Welsh dresser as a very difficult thing in the essay. The jugs that could smash, the drawers that stuck as you pulled them out. The memories aren't altogether comforting, in fact they're quite disquieting, because at the heart of it, the difficulty that the Welsh dresser raises for me is the fear of my mother's death. Although I'm half Welsh through my mother, I've only ever visited Wales, I never lived there, and so the country is a bit of a stranger to me. Yet Welsh as a language is extremely familiar. I recognise the sounds of it intimately. They always take me back to feelings of protection and comfort, being surrounded by family. But I only understand a very few. Bach, Cwtch, Nostar. I don't recognise the way the words look, and so I decided to cover Bella's sculpture with white linen. The act of screening off somehow makes the absence of the covered objects come alive as a kind of present, so maybe absent presences or perhaps even present absences. Interested in psychoanalysis and in how the human psyche works, I'm fascinated by the insight psychoanalysis offers us in terms of processes like repression, I've mentioned already today, resistance, identification, and its understandings of the ways we feel and behave towards one another have roots in childhood relations. The unconscious does not think, says Freud, on the one hand, and on the other, Jacques Lacan posits very contentiously that the unconscious is structured like a language. Though Andre Green adds a little corrective later on. Like an affect, says Green, the unconscious is structured like an affect. The unconscious resists being explained or uncovered. Like an affect, it operates more like poetry. It suggests, it constructs, it invents, it free associates, and more importantly, the more we try to cover it over, to screen it off, the more it seeks to return in bungled actions, surprise reactions, slips of the tongue, dreams. And in Ellen Sizou's exquisite essay Coming to Writing, from which this work takes its cue. The spatial aspects of psychoanalysis intrigue me as an architect, the fold of déjà vu, the return of the uncanny, the triangular structure of the Oedipal complex. When Freud talks about screen memories, he talks about how one memory might screen another, and somewhat controversially he states that we do not really have memories of childhood, just memories related to childhood. Psychoanalysis tends to consider the history of the psyche in terms of scenes, rather than the events of history, and these psychic scenes are not chronologically ordered. The unconscious, it has been argued, has no concept of chronological time. Memories and the traces of them, visual, tactile, audio, are arranged in layers, some screening others. The writer Virginia Woolf also talks of scenes. For her, scenes are memories from childhood which are somehow preserved intact and come to the surface as what she calls sealed vessels. The French analyst Jean Laplanche talks of how childhood events are inaccessible since they are screened by our first traces of our memories of them, which cover them over, preventing and presenting the resurgence of something repressed. So there's a tension that Coming to Welsh tries to approach, the space between what is screened and the screen itself. Laplanche links this act of repression and its recovery to translation, to detranslation and to retranslation. He understands repression as a kind of translation, which brings me to Walter Benjamin, who talks of translation as issuing from the original as a kind of afterlife, and how the translator, located on the outside of language, facing it like the edge of a forest, tries to find an echo of the original in a new language. Even though when I hear Welsh it sounds familiar, I still feel on the outside or edge of it. So in Coming to Welsh, rather than translate a work written in English into Welsh, I decided to work towards constructing an echo or afterlife of the original in response to my return to Welsh. I've been exploring how my memories and dreams of the Welsh dresser expressed in words can be translated into spatial materials and experience through the act of covering objects in white linen, a cloth which suggests burial shrouds, as well as the white of weddings and the act of birthing, the bedroom as well as the dining room. But perhaps most of all speaks of the women's work in the embroidered initials of the betrothed couple sheets for the marital bed, sewn by the wife-to-be, and careful, ongoing acts of repair. I also produced a written text for Coming to Welsh as a kind of accompaniment which takes its lead from the main act of screening. So the paper on which the text is written is folded like a white linen sheet. Certain words are screened and cannot be seen, where others are reflected, especially words that have two meanings, where one is dominant and the other covered or suppressed. Reading aloud this written element of Coming to Welsh, I respond to the mission itself, to the light coming in through the windows, over my shoulders, onto my eyelids, to the folds in the corners of the walls, to the undulation of the horizontal planes, to the tilts of the not-so-vertical edges. So I'll end there. Thank you. So that's a little bit long, but I think we'll start.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. Thank you very
You're
much.
welcome. Thank you.
You're happy to
Of course.
answer some questions?
Yes, absolutely.
People,
Thoughts,
comments,
responses?
questions?
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the talk. It's such a pleasure having you here. So exciting.
Oh, thank you. That's really kind.
I was just wondering, why do you think, like a general question, which is my preoccupation personally, why do you think this bodily engagement and this subjective style of writing is more perhaps common or sensible, like in feminist society or community? Why do you think it's like that? And how would you communicate this style of writing with other, let's say, disciplines or other perspectives? Because I'm using this as one of my PhD methods, and I have sometimes difficulties communicating this with other other people from different
Which kind of backgrounds are you talking into the hard sciences or?
I guess like science or even architecture. Not specifically.
Yeah, it's a fascinating topic. We could talk at length for a very long time. especially given other people that I see around I know would have views on this. I would be very careful of an essentialist argument. So I would never want to make an argument that women are closer to their bodies or something of that sort. I would want to take it through a kind of cultural framing, which is something along the lines of there's something that happens when both the body is excluded from cultural values in the making of argument and decision, which must rest somehow with the mind and with a so-called form of neutral objectivity, let's say, and that, guess what, on the outside of that too are women plus all kinds of others, not just women, all kinds of ethnicities, sexualities, races, all kinds of other bodies, if you like. So I think there's something about maybe not being entirely comfortable with what the dominant discourse that you don't feel you've been part of making, but it just doesn't quite get to what you're trying to explore. That's certainly been my case, that somehow, there's something very fascinating about a very kind of rational intellectual critique. I think that's rigor for me is incredibly important. And obviously within architecture, you need certain forms of objectivity. There are certain rules that one must work with, particularly structural, but many others as well. So, but there's something that perhaps certainly in my education and when I came to start writing, that just wasn't really enough. And that things started to kind of just make more sense to me when they were read through this other register. But it's still I still find it a little bit of a puzzle how far one's own personal history or autobiography can communicate. And that perhaps I'm very wary of writing just in one personal voice, because I think that isn't enough, that there needs to be a number of different registers of voice. So for me it's more about fractured writing, and I read something today which it was too difficult, interestingly, to read in the way that it's been written. It's been written in 4 voices. It's just come out in the ATR Architectural Theory Review, this Welsh professor coming to Welsh Piece, and that's written in 4 different voices, which are different versions of the same event. And some of those are very embodied. But I think my feeling of what's beginning to happen, thanks to a lot of the amazing work that's come out of Australian feminism, is that this is becoming, as Isabel Armstrong says, that it shouldn't be on the outside of rational analysis, that it should be questioning that and entering it in some way. So I have a feeling that there is a different kind of architectural theory that's being written at the moment. A lot of it's come out of practice-led research, which is embodied and not necessarily the preserve of feminist work at all. We're bringing a different kind of poetics, embodied poetics through, that doesn't have to necessarily be feminist. So I think there's lots of opportunities and interesting openings. But one of the things that I'm becoming much more engaged with in my writing at the moment, which is this history of mining, which I'm not going to go into all the details here, but becoming much closer to the hard science discourses in my university, and the idea that many of the things that we might even take for granted in this room around situated knowledge and so forth are a complete no-no in that area. And so for me that's a kind of new frontier of engagement, but obviously there is some amazing work by Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, and a lot of the Australian philosophers, Elizabeth Gross-Moira-Gattins, Andrea Nye and so on, working with that at the level of philosophical inquiry. And I'm really interested in doing that through a kind of embodied institutional critique. So I think the other side maybe would be about everyday life and kind of just what we do, and how do you bring that into all the micro-politics of what we get up to, which is embodied life, how to bring that into a more rarefied area of academic debate that of course shouldn't be separate from everyday life. That starts to riff off your question.
Anything else? I'm just wondering what the time is, because I don't have my watch.
It's 2:05.
Okay, all right. So we might leave there.
So if people want to come up
Yeah.
and chat, I'm going to be around, so
yes.
feel free that you can do that.
Might be easy to do that.
Hanging out.
Jane, thank you. you.
Thank you for
so much
inviting me.
coming.
It's really
Pleasure.
lovely to be here.
Thank you, and another round.